Well, what I'd like to do this morning is to change the way that you think about adolescence. That's a big aim, but I hope that when you leave today, you'll have a completely different view of what this period is. I know that not all of you work with people in that age, but if you don't yet, you're working with people who will be adolescents, and perhaps some of you are parents of people that age, and this may be helpful for that as well. And for some of you, maybe who do double duty as administrators and teachers, you will come into contact with young people this age too. As Gabe mentioned, I've been in this field for a while. I'm a New Yorker, went to school not far from here, both college and graduate school, and I was educated in New York State as well, so it's a special pleasure to be here. I've been studying adolescent development for about 40 years, and I've done research on thousands and thousands of kids from all different walks of life, all different ethnic and socioeconomic groups, and in fact all over the world. I'm still involved in a study of about more than 5,000 people between the ages of 10 and 30 in 11 different countries. And a lot of the findings that initially came from our research done on American kids look like they characterize people around the world as well. So there is something special about adolescence that isn't limited to the way young people grow up in the United States. I've also served on a lot of national panels and commissions. I chaired the National Academy of Sciences Committee on the Science of Adolescence, and I write textbooks in the field, so I have to stay up on the literature. So I have a pretty good sense of what the science of adolescence says about this period of life. And I am shocked, really, at the disconnect between what the public believes about adolescence and what the science really says about it. If you go into a bookstore and you go to the section of the store or the area of the online bookstore where they keep parents' books about teenagers, what you're going to find are a lot of survival guides. And as an exercise, if you're interested in doing this, if you go on Amazon or Barnes & Noble sometime in the next couple of days, and you look for books aimed at parents of teenagers, or even parents, or even teenagers themselves, you will be really struck at the number of books that have the word survive or survival in the title. There actually is a book out there, I'm not kidding about this, that's called How to Survive Your Dog's Adolescence. So this is a cross-species fear that we're trying to inculcate in individuals. And if you just move over to the next department, either in the store or in the online store, and look at books for parents of babies, you'll see that there aren't any books on surviving your infant's life. And I can tell you as a parent that when our son, Gabe's good friend Ben, was an infant, I thought there were times when I wasn't going to survive that stage of his life, but I never once felt that way when he was a teenager. So where has this idea come from that adolescence is something to be survived, and what impact does that have on the way we work with and raise and teach people this age, and the way that young people, think about themselves too? It's clearly, it's not working. I think the view that we have of young people in the United States in particular has not been to their best advantage. If you look at national data on things like problems that we are often at the top of the world's list, and things like reckless behavior, crime, unprotected sex, STDs. We're pretty high up there in depression, and I'll talk later about this. As I'm sure a lot of you know, rates of depression among American teenagers have been steadily creeping up. There are all kinds of theories, some with facts behind them, others without, as to why that is. But there clearly is something wrong, I think, with the way that we think about teenagers, and I think that that leads to problems in the way that we raise them. Because if you approach an experience in life as if the best possible outcome is going to be to simply survive it, you're not going to invest very much in it. And I think it's time that we stop thinking of adolescence as kind of the root canal of parenting, where you just close your eyes and wait until it's over. Because then I think you adopt a certain orientation, where your goal is to stop bad things from happening, rather than to try to promote good things in your kids. I guess that most of the schools that you're affiliated with don't have this orientation, but some of them might, and you may have friends who work at other institutions that do, and I hope that by the end of my talk this morning, you'll feel motivated to go out and proselytize a little bit about what you learned here and how we really need to think differently about this stage of life. There obviously are important reasons for people like you to have an informed and scientifically accurate view of adolescence, and obviously important reasons if you're a parent of a teenager as well. But I think that it's a societal issue. I mean, we all have a stake in making sure that the next generation of young people is happy and healthy and competent, able to take care of us when we're older. And so we need to get the word out that the way we've been thinking about adolescence as something to survive is not doing us very well. There's another reason I think that having a better view of adolescence has some special urgency now, and that's because adolescence as a developmental period is longer than it's ever been before in human history. People like me who study this age period think of adolescence as beginning in biology, beginning with puberty, and ending in culture, ending when people make the transition from the roles of young people into the roles of adulthood. And that's a reasonable way to think about how long is adolescence. How long does it take to go from puberty into adult roles? Well, we know that the age at which kids go through puberty has been declining. It continues to decline. You all, I'm sure, who work in elementary schools have seen this. But at the same time, the age at which young people transition into the roles of adulthood, they finish their formal schooling, or they become economically independent of their parents, or they establish their own residences or families, or become parents. All of those ages have been increasing. And so adolescence is being stretched at both ends. And by my estimation, today, adolescence lasts about 15 years long. And that is 3 times as long as it lasted in the 19th century, and twice as long as it lasted as recently as the 1950s. And so maybe when it was a short period of time, it was easy to just survive it. It was easy to just hold your breath and hope for the best. But you can't hold your breath for 15 years. And so we need a different way of raising and thinking about people this age. Let me just say a couple things about these demographic trends and what is driving them. Why is puberty occurring earlier and earlier? Why is it taking young people longer and longer to move into adulthood? Well, with respect to the first of them, just put some numbers on it. At the beginning of the 20th century, the average American girl got her first period when she was about 14 and a half years old. Today, it's around 12. So that is a huge drop in a relatively short period of time. And the decline in the age of puberty has been comparable for adolescent males as well. We're not as good at tracking it historically because we keep very good records of when girls go through menarche, and so there are medical records that we can look at and look back in time at those. But if you look at other comparable measures for boys, you see a similar trend. And that is really due, I think, to 3 main things, all of which, interestingly, we could do something about, and we should do something about, because there's a lot of research showing that early puberty is not good for kids. The one contributor to early puberty is obesity. And we know that in general, among people of the same chronological age, kids who are fatter go through puberty earlier than kids who are leaner. And as you know, there's been an epidemic of childhood obesity in this country and the developed world for quite some time. And so because there are more kids who are overweight and obese, there are going to be more kids who are going to go through puberty earlier. Second, so we can do something about that by trying to change kids' patterns of diet and exercise. A second contributor has been the proliferation of chemicals in the man-made environment that interfere with our normal endocrine functioning. These are called endocrine disruptors. They change the way our hormones function. And these endocrine disruptors are ubiquitous in modern life. They're not primarily, as many people think, in food, but they are in pesticides and in cosmetics and in various types of plastics, and not just in water bottles, but they're also present in plastics that are used to make furniture and household furnishings. And so we can do something about that. There have been some calls recently to ban certain chemicals which have now been shown to disrupt the body's endocrine functioning. So these chemicals trick particularly girls' bodies into thinking that there's more estrogen being secreted than there really is, and that then triggers an earlier start to puberty. And the third, and really most recently discovered contributor to early puberty is the increased exposure of our kids to light, especially light that comes from tablets and smartphones and computer screens. Why is this? Well, you probably have read, and I hope you try to follow this advice, that if you're going to sleep at night, you shouldn't read from one of these devices because the blue light that emanates from those screens interferes with melatonin in your brain, and melatonin is what makes you feel sleepy. But what isn't commonly known is that melatonin is a chemical that plays a really important role in triggering puberty. And so anything that disrupts the melatonin system in the brain is going to affect the onset of puberty as well. And we now understand that kids who are exposed to a lot of light from these devices during childhood go through puberty earlier as well. So when you add these three things up, the obesity, the endocrine disruptors, and the screen exposure, you can account for the big drop in puberty that's taken place. This has really taken teachers by surprise who hadn't been expected to see kids in their first and second grade classes showing the early signs of pubertal and sexual development. It's also important for reasons I'll come to a little bit later, because we now know that in addition to changing the external appearance of the body and changing our reproductive functioning and changing our sex drive, the hormones of puberty have a dramatic and huge impact on the brain. And the fact that this impact on the brain is occurring at an earlier and earlier age has important implications for understanding the behavior of our children. So even though I began my talk talking about the importance of thinking about what I'm going to say in terms of adolescence, a lot of the things that I'm going to say about adolescence now are increasingly applying to kids who are 7, 8, 9 years old. So even those of you who think this is not so relevant to what I do day to day might think again about that. So why has the period gotten longer? Well, it's gotten longer, as I said, because kids are taking longer to make those transitions into adult roles. So if you compare, let's say, 20-somethings today with their parents' generation, what you'll see is that they're twice as likely to still be in school as their parents were at the same age. They're only half as likely to be married. They're 50% more likely to still be receiving money from their parents. And all of those things together are encouraging them to delay becoming spouses and to delay becoming parents, because until you've developed economic independence and you're in the labor force, it's not necessarily such a great decision to get married and start having children. So all of those things are being pushed further and further along. As opposed to the research on early puberty, which clearly indicates it's a bad thing, the research on delayed adulthood doesn't say that at all. In fact, I don't think it's a problem, and I think that the media's portrayal of this as reflecting a kind of narcissistic grandiosity, laziness, among young people that's keeping them adolescents for longer because they can afford to, I think that's the wrong way to think about this. There have been changes in the labor force that have taken place over the last couple of decades that have required that people get more education in order to be able to get a good competitive job. And if you need to get more education, you need to be dependent on your families probably longer, and it's going to take you longer to move into the workplace and to establish economics from them. So I see the decision to delay entering into these adult roles as a rational decision that most people who can afford to would make if given the opportunity to do so. I do think that we should step back and ask, how do we want these years to be spent? These years, let's say from 18 to 25, what can we as educators do to equip kids with the skills to make the most out of those years? But I don't think that we should write off the current generation of young people as a bunch of ne'er-do-wells who are just mooching off their parents while they're passing time. So I've suggested how we shouldn't think about adolescence. We should not think of it as a period just to survive, just to get through. How should we think about it? And what I'd like you to leave today believing is that adolescence is a time of tremendous opportunity. It's a time when people can really thrive, but that we have to understand how to structure our educational and home and community environments to help kids really thrive. They can't do it without us. So we want to change the way we think about it, change the way the public thinks about it, change the way kids themselves think about it. And I think that we need a kind of revolution in this country that is similar to the one that took place in the way that we think about young children. And that began to take place 25 years ago in the 0 to 3 movement, when because of scientific discoveries about the brain and about the potential of young children for positive development, led to calls for better child care, better early childhood education, better prenatal care, and so on. And that was grounded in scientific discoveries that said, we got to change the way that we're raising young children like this. I think the scientific discoveries that are coming in now about adolescence make a compelling case to change our policies and our practices that affect young people. So I want to talk about what some of those scientific discoveries are first, but first I want you to do a little exercise just for a short period of time. I just want you to close your eyes and think back to your own adolescence and just let whatever images from that period of life kind of enter into your mind. So I know that when I do this, I realize that the images that I have of my adolescence are just incredibly rich and incredibly detailed. And in fact, much more detailed and much richer than the memories that I have of other periods of my life. So I went to high school in the late 1960s in suburban New York, and I can remember things from that time of my life better than I can remember what happened to me last week. And that was an awful long time ago. But why are these memories so intense? The voices that my friends had, the things that people said to each other, good or bad, the relationships that I had with people that I went to school with. And it turns out that this is not just me. I assume it's true for a lot of you out there, because this has been studied scientifically. And it turns out that, in general, people remember adolescence better than any other period of development. It's such a consistent finding in studies that we've given it a name. It's called the reminiscence bump, because if you ask people to chart out important memories and you graph that along a timeline of how old they were when those memories happened, what you see is that you get a bump during the adolescent period of time. So for a long time, people debated what this bump was about. Why should we remember adolescence better than other periods of life? And one immediate, obvious answer is that, well, all these important things happened during adolescence. Of course you'd remember it. Your first love, your first job, your first beer, maybe the first time you lived away from your parents. So there are a lot of momentous things that happen during adolescence, which might account for the fact that our memories are so intense. But then further research found that this reminiscence bump is not just true for personal experiences. The movies that we see as teenagers are recalled in more detail than movies we see at other points in time. The books that we read as teenagers are recalled better than books that we read at other points in time. The music that we listen to as teenagers is recalled better than at other points in time. Even the current events that we're exposed to as adolescents are better recalled than current events at other points in time. And that's, I think, surprising, because we don't think of people this age as being especially tuned to current events. So it's not just because of the nature of personal experiences that adolescence is so easily and deeply recalled. There must be something else going on, and we now understand it has to do with the adolescent brain. So now I want to get to that, but I want to use this reminiscence bump as a jumping off point to tell a bigger story about what's going on in the brain during adolescence and why it's so important for the work you do, for the work all educators do, and for the work that parents do. Adolescence is a time when the brain is super sensitive to experience. Super sensitive to experience. The brain, as you probably know, is a very malleable organ. It changes in response to experience. This is something that neuroscientists refer to as plasticity. So we say that the brain is plastic or malleable. That simply refers to the capacity of the brain to change in response to the experiences that it has. And because the brain is so sensitive to experience, the things that happen to us during adolescence are more likely to be recorded, and they're more deeply recorded. So adolescence is a time of tremendous brain plasticity, tremendous brain malleability. Now, I mentioned before the 0 to 3 period, early childhood. One of the impetuses for our investment in that period is knowing that the brain is very plastic during then. So we've known that for quite some time, but it's only been in the last decade that scientists have discovered that there's a second burst of brain plasticity that takes place during adolescence. And in the last several years, not only has this been confirmed, but it's been shown that this burst in brain plasticity is due to the way that pubertal hormones affect the brain. So pubertal hormones, testosterone and estrogen primarily, change the brain in ways that make it more easy to mold, more easy to modify. And it makes adolescence a special time because of the power that experience has to change the brain at this stage of life. That's important for a number of reasons, but one that directly affects all of you is that the experiences that you give your students in your schools are going to stay with them for a very, very long time, because you are responsible for these people during a period when their brains are very easily affected, permanently affected by the kinds of experiences that have. And I think that is good news for those of you who think that the work you're doing is good. And for all of us, whether you think the work you're doing is good or think there's room for improvement, it should motivate us to do even better because it does, I think, place a special urgency on this period. Now, you've probably seen all these infomercials about changing your brain, usually on public television, some guy up there on a stage talking about things you can do to change your brain. And the fact that he's selling things to help you change your brain is indicative of a belief that the brain is plastic, even during adulthood. And he's telling the truth. Our brains are always somewhat plastic. If you remember anything that I say this morning after you leave this room, there has to have been a change in your brain, or else there'd be no way for that information to be stored some way. So the brain is plastic during adulthood, just as it is earlier in life, but it's a different kind of plasticity. And this is what I think people don't fully understand. And neuroscientists draw a distinction between what we call developmental plasticity, which is the changes that take place in the brain while the brain is still developing, while the brain is still maturing. That's developmental plasticity, as opposed to adult plasticity, which refers to the changes in the brain that take place after the brain has already fully matured. During developmental plasticity, whole new brain circuits are developing, and whole brain circuits that we don't need anymore are disappearing. The brain is being rewired during infancy, childhood, and adolescence. The plasticity is transformative. That's not the case during adulthood. During adulthood, the way the brain changes is through tiny little tweaks in existing brain circuits, not in the wholesale development of new brain circuits or the elimination of unnecessary ones. So if we think about this for a moment, it means that adolescence is the last period in human development when the brain will ever be that plastic again. It's the last time in human development when the brain will ever be that easy to modify through environmental experience. And if that doesn't draw our attention, I don't know what should. This is a really, really important stage of life. That doesn't mean that we can't change after adolescence. It just means that it's much easier to change during adolescence than it ever will again. Now, even during periods of developmental plasticity, the brain isn't plastic in all regions of the brain at the same time. Some parts of the brain are plastic at some ages, and they lose their plasticity. Other parts are not so plastic, and then they become more plastic. So as an example that may be familiar to you, how many of you are parents in here? Okay? So we know that the brain's visual system loses its plasticity very, very early in life. So we know that newborns come into the world without 20/20 vision, but they develop it very, very early. And by the time they're a year and a half or so, they see as well as adults do. But as you've probably discovered, your vision doesn't get any better after that. It doesn't get any better because that part of your brain gets hardened at that point. The wiring is set. It's no longer plastic. It can't be changed except through very, very traumatic experiences or disease, unusual experiences. There are other parts of the brain that stay plastic longer than that, but not all the way into and through adolescence. So the brain system that's responsible for acquiring language remains plastic during childhood and then loses a lot of its plasticity after puberty. And this is why it is so much easier to learn a second language before adolescence than it is after. It is possible to learn a second language after you've become an adolescent, but it is much more difficult than if you are exposed to that language and taught that language before, during childhood. And that's because the language acquisition brain system is still very plastic during childhood, and it loses this plasticity as we move into adolescence. So when I say that the brain is very plastic during adolescence, the logical question to ask is where? It's not in the visual system. It's not in the language acquisition system. Where is the brain plastic during adolescence? And the answer is that the main area of plasticity in the adolescent brain is in the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of the brain that's right behind your forehead. That's where the brain remains plastic the longest, in the prefrontal cortex. What does the prefrontal cortex do? Well, it's mainly responsible for two sets of things. It is the part of the brain that is responsible for advanced thinking abilities, like reasoning, logic, planning ahead, thinking about the future consequences of our decisions. So all of the cognitive skills that we typically are trying to facilitate in secondary school are going to be grounded mainly in the prefrontal cortex. And so it's a good thing that there's an alignment between what we're trying to fix or aim or stimulate and where the brain is able to be changed during the secondary school years. But a second function of the prefrontal cortex involves self-regulation or self-control, the ability to exercise control over our emotions and our behavior and our thoughts. And the prefrontal cortex is the central locus of self-control and self-regulation in the brain. And that aspect of the prefrontal cortex is also very plastic during adolescence. Now, I want to persuade you that this is extremely important to understand, because if there is a single trait that you want your students, that you want your children, that you want the kids you work with to develop, it's strong self-control. There are hundreds and hundreds of studies now that have been done that show that kids who have strong self-regulation do better in school, they have better relationships, they have better mental health, they are less likely to develop mental health problems, they are less likely to get into trouble. A lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the marshmallow study. For those of you who aren't, that's a study where it was done at Stanford about 60 years ago now, where preschool-age kids were asked to choose between, they were presented with a marshmallow, and they were told that they could eat the marshmallow immediately, or they could wait for the experimenter to come back in and give them 2 marshmallows. And then the experimenter left the room and they timed how long the kids could wait, if they could wait at all. Some of the kids grabbed that first marshmallow immediately. Others kind of fidgeted and tried to figure out what to do. They sat on their hands. They closed their eyes. There are some very funny videos online about kids coping with this test. Some of them told the experimenter later that they pretended that they weren't marshmallows. They pretended they were clouds or pieces of cotton, things like that. But some of the kids had no trouble waiting at all. And these are the kids that had strong self-control even when they were 3 or 4 years old. Well, this sample of young children has been followed up into adulthood. They were retested as children, as teenagers, as young adults, as middle-aged adults. And there were brain scans in the last couple of assessments of them as well. And the findings are pretty remarkable, because the adults who had been ones with self-control when they were young ended up doing better in school, having higher standardized test scores, getting more prestigious and more well-paying jobs, staying out of trouble, having fewer problems like obesity or substance use. And so self-control, having a strong sense of self-control is like a lifelong gift. It's a lifelong gift. And if there's anything that we can do to help facilitate that, when we raise children, when we educate them, that is going to have payoffs for forever. And on the other side of things, we know that people who have poor self-control have a lifelong liability that is going to often get them into trouble. So people with poor self-control are more likely to end up in poverty. They're more likely to get arrested. They're more likely to have children outside of marriage. They're more likely to have trouble holding on a job. And we know that there are many reasons for people to have those kinds of problems, unemployment, criminal record, and so forth. But studies show that poor self-regulation is often a very, very important contributor to that. So that if we could, as a nation, raise the level of self-regulation in our kids, we could not only guarantee that more kids are going to be successful, we could also guarantee that fewer kids are going to fall into lives of desperation and poverty. I got interested in the development of self-control and how it's related to brain development because of my interest in adolescent health and well-being. Adolescence, from a public health point of view, is one of the greatest times in human development. Very, very low rates of illness and disease during adolescence compared to other points in time. The leading causes of health-related problems during adolescence are not illness and disease, they're behavioral. They're things that kids do to themselves and to each other. So if you look at the leading causes of death during adolescence, there are things like automobile accidents, drug overdose, homicide, suicide, accidents that don't occur in automobiles like drownings and so forth. And as somebody who studies risk-taking during adolescence, I've always been amazed to look at the epidemiological data on this. If you take any kind of risky behavior and you graph it out as a function of the age of the person engaging in the behavior, you see the exact same pattern. It looks like an upside-down U. It increases from around age 10, and it peaks in the late adolescent years, and then it declines after that. And this is true for a whole array of risky behaviors that on the surface don't seem to have anything to do with each other. It's true for crime. It's true for attempted suicide. It's true for unintended pregnancy. It's true for reckless driving. It's even true for drownings, which is really interesting because we wouldn't expect that 18-year-olds would drown more often than 12-year-olds, but they do. We wouldn't expect that 18-year-olds would drown more often than 28-year-olds, but they do. It can't be because they're weak. It can't be because they don't have stamina. It's got to be due to something else, and it's probably due to the fact that 18-year-olds make very bad decisions about where and when to swim, and that's why they have accidental drownings, as well as other kinds of accidents. I got interested in this to try to understand why is it that adolescents take so many risks compared to people of other ages, and is there anything that we can do about this? So I started to do brain research on this topic to try to figure out what is it that's going on. And there are two things that help explain it. You need both parts of it to really get a full picture. Well, one thing that happens during adolescence is that when these pubertal hormones hit the brain shortly after puberty, they increase the amount of activity in the brain that involves a neurotransmitter called dopamine. We've all heard of dopamine. Dopamine serves a lot of purposes in the brain, but one of the most important purposes that it serves is the experience of reward, the experience of pleasure. So when you feel happy about something, when you feel pleasure, when you feel rewarded, when you anticipate feeling happy about something, like before karaoke night tomorrow, you get a little dopamine squirt. And that extra dopamine activity in your brain is what creates the feeling of pleasure. Now, puberty and the pubertal hormones increase dopamine activity in the brain's reward centers. There's more dopamine activity in those areas of the brain during adolescence than at any other point in development. Now, this is difficult news in a variety of ways. It's difficult because, as I'll explain, it contributes to adolescent risk-taking, which contributes to health and injury problems. But it's also difficult because what it means is that for all of us in this room, nothing will ever feel as good for the rest of our lives as it felt when we were teenagers. So one way to think about this is that when you're an adolescent, things that feel good feel even better. They love the same things that we love, but they get much, much more pleasure out of them than we do because they have so much more dopamine activity in those parts of the brain that process reward. Now, when you are, the term we use is reward sensitive. When you're very sensitive to reward, very responsive to reward, the logical thing to do is to be on the lookout for it and to go after it. And a lot of the risk-taking that adolescents do is in the pursuit of things that they think are going to be rewarding. Psychologists call this sensation-seeking. And sensation-seeking follows the same U-shaped, upside-down U-shaped curve that risk-taking does. And it follows the same upside-down U-shaped curve that dopamine activity does as well. So as we get more sensitive to and easily aroused by rewards, we start to engage in more and more activities in the pursuit of feeling good. More and more activities that are exciting, that are novel, that we think are going to lead to rewarding and pleasant outcomes. And that pull toward engaging in those activities is so intense that we often engage in activities that are potentially very harmful and potentially very risky. I mean, I can remember as a teenager, they had just opened up a parkway near where we grew up called the Sprain Brook Parkway in Westchester County. And when it was first opened, nobody knew it was there, nobody used it, and we would get out there and we would see how fast we could drive on that parkway at, 2 o'clock in the morning. And we, 100 miles an hour, nothing at all. I can't even imagine what it would feel like to do that now. I would be so frightened by it. And the reason is that when I was 16, all of that rush from driving that fast felt great. And it overshadowed any fear that I had that something bad might happen. So we do a lot of risky and reckless things at that age because we're so focused on the reward. Now, hold that in mind for a second, because the other part of the brain that figures into this story is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is still maturing during adolescence. Remember, it's still very plastic. It takes a long time to mature. We now know that that region of the brain isn't fully mature until the mid-20s. So you've got this situation during middle and late adolescence where you have the accelerator pressed all the way down to the floor before there's a good braking system in place. Right? And that mismatch between this easily aroused accelerator and this still developing braking system is what creates a lot of problematic behavior during adolescence. We talk about, in the work that I do, a maturational imbalance. The imbalance between the arousal of the reward system, which occurs early in adolescence, and the very slow maturation of the prefrontal cortex. This means that adolescence is an inherently risky time. It's an inherently risky time. We see that in risk-taking behavior. And in our cross-cultural studies, we see the same U-shaped curve. So it's not just in America that kids take more risks during late adolescence. It's in Europe, and it's in Africa, and it's in Asia, and it's in South America, and it's in the Middle East. And we've been doing studies in all those areas. So it's something inherent in the adolescent brain. So as educators, then, we have to ask, well, what can we do about this? your schools, like most schools, probably spend a lot of time involved in some kind of health education. Sex education, drug education, smoking education, whatever. This has been the approach that most countries, especially the United States, has taken to try to reduce adolescent risky and reckless behavior. We don't want our kids to do those things. We're just trying to figure out how to stop them from doing them. And those programs are very good at changing what kids know, but they're very bad at changing how they behave. They're good at changing what they know, they're bad at changing how they behave. I, for a while, was on a commission for the Allstate Foundation, and we looked at teen safe driving, what we could do as a country to promote that, diminish teen fatal automobile accidents. So I spent a couple of years on this panel, meeting a lot of people in the auto safety field. You'd be surprised to know that driver education has absolutely no impact on kids' driving safety. Changes how they score on tests of knowledge about driving. Doesn't change how they drive. Pretty much the same thing about sex education, about drug education, about smoking education. Now, I'm not saying that we should not do those things, because I think it's important for kids to know the facts about those things. But what I am saying is that we need a much more realistic sense of what those programs are going to accomplish, and we need to add something else into the mix. And that's what I want to turn to next. Because there's nothing we can do about the activation of the brain's reward centers at adolescence. That's caused by puberty. That increased need to seek pleasure during adolescence is what propels us to look for sexual mates. We don't want to interfere with that process. We might not want it to occur when people are 10, but we don't want to interfere with that process. There's nothing we can do to stop kids from going through puberty, and there's nothing we can do that's going to change the way puberty affects their brain. But what we can do is strengthen that braking system. And that's what a lot of research right now on translating adolescent brain science into school-based policy and practices is about. What can we do to help build a stronger prefrontal cortex? What can we do to help make that braking system stronger so that when kids have these urges and inclinations to do crazy things, they'll have the tools and the skills to at least slow those urges down and stop them from doing as many of those crazy things as they might otherwise do. So I want to talk a little bit about what we know about the facilitation of prefrontal cortical development. And there really are 5 things that schools could be doing. And I hope that your schools are doing at least some of these. So one is mindfulness. So we know now, there's very good research on this, that mindfulness activities strengthen self-regulation, and they strengthen the functioning of the prefrontal cortex. When we talk about mindfulness, generally, I think the thing that first comes to mind is meditation. And meditation certainly is a way to achieve and facilitate and further the development of mindfulness. But it's not the only thing that does that. Not everybody likes to meditate, and not everybody finds it easy to learn how to meditate. But there are other things that facilitate mindfulness. Things like yoga. Things like certain kinds of martial arts. You can do walking meditation. You can learn to meditate while you run. So the important thing is to incorporate a mindfulness orientation into these activities, because practicing mindfulness strengthens that muscle. It strengthens the self-regulatory system. And as I mentioned before, there now are brain imaging studies that show the before and after of mindfulness training and the impact on the prefrontal cortex. So we have a better understanding of what that is. When I travel around the country and I give talks to schools and parents, I discover happily that there are some schools around the country that have now incorporated this into their daily curriculum. They might start the day, they might start first period with 5 or 10 minutes of guided meditation. And they have seen improvements in their students' mental health, and they have seen decrements in their students' behavior problems, and they have seen some improvements in student achievement. And so when schools tell me they don't have time for something like this, my response is investing 10 minutes a day in this and taking 10 minutes away from some other kind of structured instruction that you think is making a difference is going to actually improve their achievement more. So mindfulness is one thing, and this is a message, by the way, that you can get out to parents, because it's good for them too, right? Mindfulness has been shown to be really good for your heart health. It's really good for your immune system. It's not some touchy-feely thing anymore. We really have a good sense of the science around it. So that would be one thing you could do to help your students develop better self-control. A second is exercise. Aerobic exercise is tremendously important for the brain. For those of us my age and around my age, you know, we're told all the time about crossword puzzles and this and that. Nothing is as good for your brain as aerobic exercise is, because it increases blood flow to your brain. Blood is what your brain needs to function well and to develop and to repair itself and so forth. So all children in elementary and secondary school should be getting an hour a day of aerobic exercise. And if they're not getting it at school, you need to convince them and their parents that they can get it when they're not in school. I don't know what your situations are in your schools. In public schools, unfortunately, physical education has been cut back dramatically. And in lots of public schools, the only kids who get regular aerobic exercise are the kids that are on the teams. And the ones who aren't on varsity teams don't get the exercise that they need to get. And that's very bad, not just for their physical health, not just to reduce obesity, but it's very bad for their brain health as well. That's another message you can give to your parent community and to your student community. A third is sleep. Sleep deprivation among American students is epidemic right now. Sleep, as you probably know, a terrific book came out a couple years ago called Why We Sleep, which is I really recommend. Very accessible and very, very compelling. Sleep is the time when the brain repairs itself. The brain is cleaning out gunk that accumulates in there during the day. It's a time when the brain is consolidating the information that's learned during that day. So this idea, from a neuroscientific point of view, this idea of cramming kids' heads full of information and occupying them in those activities so much that they don't get adequate sleep is completely counterproductive, because they won't remember that stuff unless they get enough sleep to consolidate the information that they've been introduced to during the course of the day. And so when I hear about schools that have schedules where kids are tied up in extracurriculars until the late afternoon or early evening hours, come home, grab a quick dinner, and then do 4 hours of homework, and go to sleep at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning and get up at 6:30 or 7 to get to school on time the next day, I'm just astonished that those kids are even walking. And you know, if you're a classroom teacher, that during first period they are not there. I mean, they're sitting in their seats, but their brains are completely asleep. So we need to rethink the way that we organize our kids' lives to make sure that they have adequate exercise and adequate sleep. A fourth thing that you can do is to help teach your school's parents how to be better parents. Oh, see, you didn't laugh at anything else. That's so interesting. You know, parent education is an important part of what schools should be doing. And we now know a lot about the relationship between parenting and self-regulation, and that kids who are raised in homes that practice authoritative parenting, that's parenting that combines being warm and being firm, those kids develop better self-regulation as a consequence of that. And so it's important, you know, to have programs that introduce parents to what your school is doing in an academic point of view, but, you know, if you have some time to put on events that help parents improve their parenting skills, and just even explain to them that what they do at home is going to help their kids' psychological development and brain development, that's important. You all know this. The relationship between schools and parents has to be a collaborative one, right, in which they both have the goal of helping their children develop in positive ways. You know, you don't want parents to look to you as the only influence on how their kids develop. And you're not going to look at parents as the only influence on how their kids develop. But you have a lot to explain to parents, to teach to parents on what they can do better. Frankly, and I do really try to convince parents of this, what you don't want parents to do is to do their kids' homework for them. And you have to disabuse parents of the notion that that's the proper involvement for them to have. As I tell parents, when you do your child's homework for her, her math teacher is grading her on what you know, not on what she knows. You don't know enough to teach your child math. And if your child is having a problem in school, the first person you should talk to are your child's teachers. And then figure out what is the appropriate role for a parent. What is the appropriate role for the school, and what is the appropriate relationship between the two? But there are some things you can help parents do better. So the fourth is parent education. The last one, and I want to spend a little time on this, because it's an issue that comes up a lot in independent schools when I speak to them, is stress. Stress is really bad for the brain. When we are under stress, our bodies secrete cortisol. Cortisol actually has a very toxic effect on the white matter in the brain. It eats away, it erodes the white matter in the brain. White matter in the brain is really important because it serves as kind of an insulation around neural circuits. And so when that white matter is eroded, impulses in the brain aren't transmitted as effectively and as efficiently. So MS is a disease of white matter in the brain. That's why people who have MS have trouble with certain motor movements, because those neural circuits have been compromised by lesions in the white matter there. So when we stress kids out, when adults get stressed too, it eats away at some of the white matter in the brain. So it's not good for brain health. And there are a lot of kids in this country who are under a tremendous amount of stress. And I think that we, meaning us as educators and parents and school administrators, have confused two things. We've confused challenge and stress. And I want to speak a little bit about the difference between the two. Challenge is very good for the brain, and very good for prefrontal cortical development. In fact, the brain improves its thinking abilities by being challenged, by being asked to do a little bit more than it had been doing previously. But those of you who took psychology classes in college know of a concept called scaffolding. Scaffolding is when you present a challenge to a student that is within the student's reach. When you're asking the student to do something that he hasn't been asked to do before, but that you know he has the capability of doing. That's what challenge is. Stress is when we're asked to do things that we can't possibly do. Challenge is really good for the brain. Stress is really bad for the brain. And so when you work with your teachers, you need to get them to understand and to ask themselves, are the assignments that I'm giving my child, my students, are those going to challenge them, or are they going to stress them? Rote, repetitive activity does not challenge the brain. It does not challenge the brain. I got an email the other day. I hear, it's fun, sometimes a little overwhelming, but I hear from students all the time. I got an email the other day from an 8th grader wanting to know, who was participating in a debate in her school about whether homework was good or bad. And, you know, I said, it's too complicated a question. It depends on what the homework is, and it depends on how much homework is assigned. If the homework is rote, repetitive activity that just keeps somebody up until 1 o'clock in the morning, it does more harm than good. If the homework is challenging a student to do something that she hasn't been asked to do before, but where she has the skills to be able to do it, it is good to do, as long as it doesn't keep her up till 1 o'clock in the morning doing it. So my general advice to schools on this issue is, you can probably get by with less homework, but better homework. And that will be effective for facilitating your kids' brain development and cognitive development. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about mental health and student mental health. Some of you may have seen reports in the news media, I think 2 weeks ago maybe, I think the New York Times had a story on it, on the substantial increase in the last 10 years in depression and anxiety among American teenagers and young adults. Does that ring a bell with anybody in here? So there are very reliable national surveys that show that the number of kids who are reporting feeling depressed, being depressed, feeling anxious, seeking treatment for these, even feeling suicidal, has been on the rise. And it had been declining for a while, then it had been flat for a while, but it's clearly going up now. So there's no dispute about that among people who study people this age. The dispute is about what's causing it. So let me try to separate out here the facts and the hyperbole. As far as the research shows, this increase in depression is not caused by social media. I know that's what a lot of you think, and there's good reason for a lot of you to think that, because that's what's published in the popular press over and over and over again. It is true that during this same time that depression has risen among American teenagers, smartphone and social media use has risen among American teenagers too. But just because two aggregate trends follow the same pattern doesn't mean that one is necessarily causing the other. I mean, for starters, it's very plausible that it's depression that's driving social media use and not social media use that's driving depression. Because there's all kinds of reasons to think that if you're depressed and you feel lonely and isolated, you're going to turn to finding people electronically, online. So these correlational studies don't tell us what's causing what. But it also could be that there's something else going on in the world during this same time period that's contributing to increases in adolescent and young adult depression and anxiety. And I was embroiled in a very argumentative Twitter exchange over the last couple weeks. I finally, for the first time, got blocked on Twitter by somebody. Because I kept posting articles saying, here, look, this is an article, it was just published in Nature. You don't get a better journal in the sciences than Nature. And it was based on a couple of British scientists' analysis of surveys of hundreds of thousands of people that looked at the relationship between in teenagers, mental health and social media use, and found that there wasn't a relationship between them. A study came out last year in the best journal in my field, a journal called Psychological Science. It found the exact same thing. There are at least a half a dozen major literature reviews that say if you look, even if you just look at the correlation, it's not there, much less proving that there's a causal relationship between the two. So the proponents of the argument that this is being caused by social media fought back and said, well, what's the harm in telling parents that they should worry about their kids' social media use? Well, you know, as a scientist, we don't like to propagate ideas that aren't true, but there is harm in it. And the last thing that I want is for a parent whose kid seems depressed to think that she's going to solve that problem by taking away her kid's iPhone. Because that probably won't do anything for it. So I'm asked a lot, and maybe some of you are asked a lot, what should parents' policies be about smartphone use and social media use? And I encourage parents to ask themselves 3 questions before deciding what to do. The first is, and this is the most important one, what is your child not doing because of all the time that she's spending on her smartphone? Because if the answer is, well, she's not watching television as much, then I'm not so worried about the fact that she's using her smartphone rather than watching television. But if the answer is that she's not sleeping, I'm worried about it. If the answer is that she's not exercising, I'm worried about it. And if the answer is that she's not reading, I'm worried about it. So there's nothing special, in my mind, there's nothing particularly special about social media as an activity, except for what it might be displacing that are activities that we know that are good for kids. The second question is, if you were able to persuade or force your child to cut back on social media use, what would you replace the time with? Are you prepared to make suggestions? Are you prepared to introduce other activities into your child's daily schedule? Because you're going to want to fill that time or help your child fill that time with something. And then the third question is, have you looked at your own social media use recently? Because if you're sitting there at dinner with your child and you're on your phone while you're having dinner, I don't think you can expect your child to behave in a different way. And so if you're concerned in your own families or in the families of your students in overuse of these devices and overuse of social media, I think it needs to be approached as a family-related intervention, not just one that's aimed solely at the child. Okay. So I want to leave some time for questions, but I just want to sum up here with what I think you're probably already doing well in your schools, but just in case, I need to say this too. We need to help kids develop the non-cognitive skills that they're going to need to be successful in the world. And those non-cognitive skills, in one way or another, have a lot to do with self-regulation. They get called different things. We can call it grit. We can call it perseverance. We can call it determination. We want kids to be able to control and regulate their own behavior. That lesson, what you can do to cultivate that, is going to be even more important than what theorems they learn in geometry class. And so by structuring school to actively encourage that through meditation or yoga or exercise or whatever, by structuring assignments to emphasize challenge over quantity, by helping parents be aware of what their kids need in terms of sleep, to develop in healthy ways, you can really do a lot. It's going to give a gift to these children that they're going to take with them when they leave. Now, I don't have a lot to say to you as admissions officers, but I will say this. When you're trying to make decisions about kids, see if you can look in their records for indices that they have this kind of grit, self-regulatory ability, ability to persist at a task. I think you can see that in all kinds of ways, including looking at their extracurricular records, which may show steady, deep involvement in things in which they've been trying to get better rather than a broad array of things to kind of just pad their applications. I think you can, by talking to the parents, get a sense of what this child is like. You could use some of these measures. Some of you may be familiar with Angela Duckworth's book, Grit. Angela is a very, very close friend of mine. That scale has been effective in predicting who succeeds. In college, I'm not sure how effective it's been in predicting who succeeds in primary and secondary school, but you could try doing something like that as well. But I think it's almost more important that you get your schools to do what they can to help facilitate this development than necessarily to try to screen for it. So, final words. I do hope that you leave here today with a different vision of what adolescence is, that it's a vision that you can communicate to your colleagues, to the parents, to the students in your school, that it's not just something to be survived. It's a time of tremendous opportunity, and that opportunity is enabled by the plasticity of the brain. And so let's go out there and try to take advantage of this opportunity that biology has given us by making adolescence the way it is. So thank you very much for your attention this morning.